Hello everybody, and welcome back. I've been in my studio this morning, pacing back and forth, wondering about how to talk about the Romantic movement, the Romanticism in painting. My head is bursting. So we want to start by putting it in context. We've been talking about this debate that forms in the art academies between emotion and intellect, right? What should art do? How should it appeal to people? Right? Starting with Poussin versus Rubens, Delacroix and Ingres, and they're sort of carrying on that debate, right? A century or two later. So Delacroix is, some people consider him an early romantic painter. There were certainly romantic tendencies in his work, and that just really has to do with the expression of emotion, right? Which has always been there. To some extent in the art academy. So some painters leaned that way and others toward that very precise realism that you see in Ingres and also Poussin. Delacroix is an influence on a lot of romantic painters, but I wouldn't classify him as a romantic painter because romanticism is very different from the emotionalism that we see, from the Baroque onward. The appeal to emotion in the Baroque is to use it as a way to get to people, to bring them a message, right? So we're using emotion as a tool to tell a story or to illustrate a principle, to bring to mind a historical event or a biblical event. And the best way to do that was this appeal to the emotions, to reach out and grab people and pull them into the story and make them feel as if they're there, right? As opposed to just drawing a nice, clear narrative picture of the story. And so this is using emotion as a way to bring a message to people, right? To bring them into a story, to illustrate a moral or something like that. Romanticism is very different. We see Romanticism first in landscape painting. And we've talked about how landscape painters, from early on, even back into the late medieval, the Gothic period with Peter Bruegel, the Dutch landscape painters, people like that who began to paint the landscape less as just sort of a backdrop for the scene and more for its own sake, to paint the landscape, to encounter it, and to make it really more the subject of the painting. The romantic landscape painters do that too, but there's a change. There's really a fundamental shift. So romanticism engages the landscape as some kind of primordial encounter to create this sense of awe in the face of nature, right? The landscape is not just something to kind of explore for its beauty and harmony and things, but to bring up these strong, overwhelming emotions of awe and this, like I said, primordial encounter of some kind. So what the romantic landscape painters are trying to do is to return to nature in a way that goes back before any notions in human history of empire or civilization or government or organized religion. Everything prior to that, some sort of savage, primordial, primitive state, right, that was pure and that really summed up the human condition in their mind. So they're approaching the landscape in a completely different way. This is a rejection of rationalism that had taken hold, after the Enlightenment. It's a rejection of the Industrial Revolution. So, already in Europe during the 18th, 19th centuries, we start to see people being pulled off the farms and the landscape, being concentrated in cities, and things like factories and coal mines and mills and things springing up in the landscape. And already there's a response against that. And the landscape painting, the early romantic landscape painting, is part of that response. Baroque was using emotion as a tool, as a way to reach people. Romantic painting, emotion is portrayed for its own sake, right? It's the experience of emotion that these artists are after, not using emotion as a way to bring in some other kind of ideas or to tell stories in a more effective way. It's the experience of emotion that they're really after. And you could see this in an early romantic, the first romantic novel, or one of the very earliest ones, was Frankenstein. Frankenstein is a romantic story because it's about summoning up these feelings of dread and horror. It's not the use of emotion, it's practically the worship of emotion. It's a way, a philosophy of looking at life that says the only things we can really be sure of are our thoughts and emotions, right? Rationalism falls apart, science, religious experience, especially organized religion. But my own feelings, my own experiences at the moment, those are the only things I can't doubt. And so we see that beginning, like I said, in Dutch landscape painting, and then farther on with the paintings of Rousseau, the French painter, and you can see in his paintings these lone trees sort of standing against the storm. And that's kind of a recurring theme in romantic landscape because it's about these individual emotions and experiences. It's about the individual. Romanticism is about the experience of the individual. And a romantic painter is trying to express himself. The subject of the painting is his own feelings, right? Or her own feelings. And the romantic landscape painters like Caspar David Friedrich summed these things up as well with his paintings that were kind of like Frankenstein novel. They're eerie, they're full of mist and mystery and loneliness, and you often see these sort of singular figures or singular kind of structures against a very foggy or stormy backdrop, a very dramatic backdrop. And it emphasizes this idea of individuality and emotionalism. So it's these two things really that set Romanticism apart from the Baroque, is this emphasis on the individual and the practical almost worship of emotion as the whole point of the exercise. It's not a tool, it's not a way to tell a story. The emotional impact is the point. So going on from Friedrich, Thomas Cole and Albert Bierstadt were great landscape painters in what they called the Luminist school. And they were painting images of the New World, of the Americas, and bringing back images that people could hardly believe. But it was these overwhelming landscapes and the sense of light and openness and space. This is an encounter with nature, an overwhelming encounter with nature that leaves us awestruck. And this is what romantic landscape painters like Cole and Bierstadt are about. John Constable was an English painter, member of the British Academy, and encountered the landscape in a different way. His approach is more pastoral, more gentle landscapes and things, but still looking at the landscape as an emotional encounter. Turner, J.M.W. Turner, is another member of the British Academy who creates landscapes that are so emotional that the landscape almost gets lost. He's trying to create the sensation of being in a storm or being on a ship at sea. He's not really trying to paint a representation of the sea during a storm, but the feeling of being at sea during a storm. So this is all, again, it's what this Baroque interest in emotion grows into, but it's also a rejection of the Baroque because it wants to go back to some primitive human experience that predates governments and states and crowns and organized religion, and is just mankind and the world around him and this encounter. So this is what Romanticism is about. If you've read any Nietzsche, if you know anything about Nietzsche's philosophy of individualism, right, about the will to power, it's also really touching on that. It's all part of what's going on in society at the time. So Romanticism is an expression of what's going on in the broader culture. It changes our interest in emotion from something that is a secondary experience to something that's primary, that's right at the center of our experience. So that's Romanticism. Next time, we'll look at realism, which is kind of the reverse of Romanticism and a reaction against Romanticism.